Good morning. Good to see some of you old friends here, some from very far abroad and some that live locally. We're going to give a little talk about our work, and it's on the heels of an exceptional presentation this morning, but I think what I want to talk about from our perspective is really kind of an advocacy of being holistic about what's going on. And I don't think anyone wants to argue with the necessity for sustainability. Technology, certainly, and engineering are really the root of all tall buildings. But I hope that our approach is really more holistic. Peter Rees said yesterday morning that no matter what we do, people are going to be looking for choice, he said, because it's more fun. And I actually believe in having some fun with it, too. The other thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is placemaking. We've looked at a lot of extraordinary shapes. Some have propellers on them. Some are curving. Some are twisted. But at the base of all of these buildings is where we actually live. So we're going to talk a little bit about placemaking. On we go. There's two inescapable reasons for tall buildings, aside from all the other factors that we look at, and they're density, in our view, and aspiration. Certainly, urban density is a global issue, and it really is about managing space, whether it's a city like this, which runs along a gulf a couple miles inland, or whether it's something like Manhattan. Now, these are just some graphics, but I find them quite interesting. 1950, cities over 1 million. 75, 2000, and you can see for yourself the density that we're dealing with. So really, as a projection, just by little dots of light, there's an inescapable conclusion that the densities that we're dealing with are going to call for taller buildings. The other thing that we kind of seem to forget is we basically need the land that we have right now, arable land, to feed ourselves. We don't have enough. I suppose we could all stop eating cows and become vegetarians, but that's unlikely to happen. So the reality is that we are facing a real dilemma in basic terms in arable land, and that's scarcity. And all these graphs really do is to prove to you that I've actually studied this and that there's some truth in what I'm saying. Arable land will become a major issue and will drive the creation of more dense, more tall buildings. The other thing that I've brought along are these kind of interesting diagrams. These are done by NASA, and they are actually a collection of data that is not only population densities, but it's traffic movements and transactions, pathological behavior, all that stuff built into these little models. Now you can see in Europe, fairly low density, but we get here into the Middle East and we start to look at extraordinary densities. In the United States, a little less consistent, but in Asia, unavoidably, some serious densities that we're going to deal with. And for me, these start to reflect the kind of architecture and the story of these places. Because again, we think this is as much about storytelling, about history and placemaking as about sustainability. Aspiration. We heard all kinds of justifications for the tallest building in the world this morning. The reality is, it is about aspiration, and it goes right back to things like the pyramids that are about aspirations of a society or an individual. The little shot on the lower left there is from a guy named Peter Bruegel the Elder in about 1550, and his version of utopia in a tall form. This guy is one of my favorites. This is about 1750s, and I'm sure you can see the scale of this building. This was a cenotaph to Newton that he designed, obviously unbuildable at that point, some 400 meters tall. And this guy, although probably many of you didn't know, was an aspiring architect himself. But his first move was to tear down that beautiful cathedral on the left, and in its place, he planned to build that. Now, that was to rival the Empire State Building, be taller, to be grander, and obviously an expression of aspiration, not of necessity. The reality is that they didn't really know how to build this, so after they tore the cathedral down, the site flooded, and Stalin, in his wisdom, decided to make the world's largest swimming pool, which in fact they did. But it was a very shallow pool because Stalin was a very short man. The irony in that situation is they then rebuilt the cathedral, and that's in fact where Boris Yeltsin was laid to rest. So aspiration, absolutely. Nothing to do with sustainability or economics. And then one of my other favorite guys, just by way of a little history, and his aspiration was to cover Manhattan with a 1,000-foot-high dome. Why? To make it more sustainable, to control the air quality, to actually make a more sustainable place. Obviously, a little bit beyond his technological wherewithal as well. But the ultimate story for aspiration is this building. This building inspired stories. We heard about King Kong this morning. It inspired romance, Beauty and the Beast. It brought some new thinking about workplace practices and what we would do in the workplace. It certainly brought some technology. The building was built in 1931. It was built at the height of the Depression. It was built in 15 months. I'd like to see us repeat that exercise. But clearly it was about the aspiration of New York City to plant itself on the world's map as the leading place of commerce. And again, nothing to do with commerciality or the desire. It actually stood as the world's tallest building for some 40 years. Just there last week, gorgeous still, and still a landmark that represents this city, and really not about kind of economics. Okay, a couple things that we think are important, a couple criteria in addition. Certainly sustainability is important. We also believe that we have to look at the way people live now, and that's driving a number of our schemes. That means understanding the market. But finally, and most importantly for us, I think, is the idea of urban design, quality urban design, and we heard about that a bit. So the first place we're going to start is in Manchester, England, which is a city experiencing extraordinary regeneration following an IRA bombing, really, that set off the plan for what we see there now. It really is a laboratory for regeneration and projects. We happen to be involved at a site, frankly, it's an old parking lot. It's an old rail yard next to Piccadilly Station, but as an urban design exercise, completely connected. So the site and these little circles you see are the connectivity into the city. We tend to do a pattern diagram like this, just to look for the clues and the rumors the history of the city offers us. And you know, most of our stuff starts with a little scribbly sketch like this, the Rosetta Stone, that unlocks the development for our commercial interests, our clients, but also looks at how we're going to connect to the city. Some little scribbles, and then ultimately starting to look now at the connection, in this case, to the third busiest railway station in Europe, which is Manchester's Piccadilly Station, and you see the connection there. Now, we like to use hand-drawn stuff because it's evocative, and again, I think, again, we're talking about tall buildings, but tall buildings have to be about the place they're in, they have to be about connecting to the transport they're next to, and they have to be about placemaking. So we always start with these kind of drawings to understand how we're going to connect and be part of the urban fabric we live in, and some of the gestures here. We also believe that tall buildings need to come to ground in a recognizable way. I happen to be from Chicago, although after 20 years in London, you can tell I now have an English accent, but they do this very well in Chicago, and that is that the entry to a building, you can feel the building come to ground. You can experience the height, the scale, the heroic nature of that building. And then obviously, again, some connectivity issues. This stair will rival in scale the Spanish Steps in Rome and will connect two quadrants of the city. Computer studies, lifting, somebody else can tell you about all that stuff. It's important. But one of the things that we were interested in on the sustainable side was the notion of a 60-level building where every space, every bedroom, every hotel room, every dining room had an operable window in that space. Now, I can tell you in Europe that's a pretty novel idea, and it certainly is in the United States as well. So we came up with a system of what we call pop-out windows so that every one of these windows is operable in every one of these spaces, and the imagery of how this building will look as it begins on site this past January. So what do we get out of that? Well, we got Part L compliant. We got BREEAM excellent, all the good badges that we want to wear for sustainability, but what we really got out of that is a wonderful urban design space that will work for Manchester, a canal at the base, the entry to the hotel, and how that building will take its place in the city. Okay, next study, completely different, is a study about dynamics of being next to a train station and honoring a historic building in the middle, and yes, we'll talk about sustainability as well. But really, again, this is about an urban design composition. You can see the train station and the train tracks as they run through the site. Right in the middle of this site is a little historic building. So our buildings are meant to clasp this or to reinforce the space between. And you see the kind of massing that we start to get with that historic building and the vocabulary of the building, which represents these trains racing by. Mixed use, again. One of the signatures of our practice is understanding of how to stack uses, how to put office buildings with hotels on top, with residential on top, and how to mix those uses effectively. So we see the mixed use here. And what do we get for that? Well, fortunately, we got a sustainable rating, or we wouldn't be talking about it here. We got a 5-star green rating and a LEED gold rating. But again, you can see the vocabulary of the building relates much differently to that train track as it races by the building and informs the architecture. And ultimately, the space that we create for people, where a tall building says this is a destination, and the ground plan that we get. Okay, we'll move now to Melbourne, Australia, and a very orthogonal grid, a very rectilinear grid informing an office building that we designed there. And you can see, again, we start with the hand sketches. George visited us early in the scheme. He looks a little worried there to me already at that point, but he did visit. And again, the notion of that rectangular language informing this office building, and the idea that an office building doesn't need to be the same on all 4 sides. Now again, in most cities, now we start to see this happening at this point in time, groundbreaking, the idea that all 4 sides might not be the same. And the reason for that is to handle the climate issues that we deal with there and articulate the architecture. So you start to see these bars of building as they run up and down, and how that was articulated. But again, always thinking about the ground plane, always thinking about the public realm, always thinking what it's like for a 5'6" human being to move through the space around our building. Ultimately, the environmental solution was very straightforward. On the hot face of the building, the image on your right, or on my right, excuse me, is just a simple thermal chimney that takes the heat off the building. That building is now there, and there's that little chimney that articulates it. And again, we were able to get a 5-star greenhouse rating. This one's more about the story. And again, this is in the City of London. This is about the history of the place. So again, I'd like to emphasize in my talk that sustainability and technology are important, but the story of a place, the history of its place, what informs our design is equally important. This happens to be a painting by Lowry, who's a favorite of mine, and you'll notice that the people in the city are always in motion. They're never upright, they're always on the move. And if ever there were a place on the move, it's Dubai at the moment. The other thing we looked at were the Elgin marbles. And interestingly enough, the Elgin marbles take a static thing, an office building, a static square thing, and turn them in dimensionally into something that's 3D. So the little plan you see along the bottom there is actually what you'd get from those carvings of those horses if you look down in plan view. So 2 things, the idea of putting a static building in motion and the idea of layering even through a static idea. And some, of course, those little ugly scribbles to start us off, and then some beautiful computer models to look at how we might animate an otherwise static and square office building. Actually lean the building 9 degrees to put it in motion and cause that dynamic. The structure, and again, we'll let the engineers tell you that leaning a building 10 degrees is a bit of a challenge. The lifting, as we know, is critical to it. But for us, how the building comes to ground in the city, how it meets the ground plane, and how people embrace the front door of that building, also very important. And how that building could look on the skyline in the City of London, and again, the dynamics of a building in motion rather than a static building, and our addition to the skyline in the city. And London is changing, and you're going to start to see a skyline like that in London instead of the old one. Okay, last one, home stretch. The idea behind this really is this notion of holistic, the notion of really bringing all these factors into play. But again, most importantly, to connecting that ground plane to what's important. Is that the 3-minute bell there? Might be. So this is what we're about, these 3 goals. And again, I'll kind of flip through these because these are basically about connecting a famous place in the city with its waterfront and creating a ground plane and creating a pedestrian realm, which is about making a place. Yes, there's going to be a tall building. Yes, it's going to be sustainable. But most importantly, the people of this city are going to be able to walk through this building and have a destination that they didn't have before. And again, the hand-drawn, evocative thing to help take us along and understand what we might be doing there. How am I doing, Chief? 2 minutes, okay. Again, the CGIs as well, but you can start to see the space that we're trying to create under this building. I'm going to gallop here. The next thing that we like to do is we like to understand how the building works. Now, this is an office building, so we want to understand how it works from the inside out. And again, it's one of the things Woods Bagot bring is a range of expertise on these types of buildings. So some little diagrams that start to look at how this thing might set itself up. And then floor plate efficiencies. Again, you guys will be aware of this, but this is the inside-out approach. And we'll look at how people might actually work in that place. Again, we hear a lot about tall buildings at this conference, these wonderful objects, the things that are happening. I think for us, it's absolutely essential that not only do we remember people coming to these buildings at the base of the building, but also how they're going to live and work in this space is critical. And then finally, I'll walk through the environmental side of this, and that is looking at how we can, in fact, make this an environmental responsive building by creating an atrium, again, the thermal chimney, which is the way it works in these climates, a veil at the base of the space to protect that space, a different face of a building on a different elevation. Again, we still see buildings that have a 360-degree uniform treatment. And finally, the image of that building and how we intend it to be. I think my time's up. Thank you very much. Holistic. Think holistic.